Wait. What?
Welcome to Why Believe. I'm your host, Chad Ostrowski.
And I am Brian Young, your guest for today.
All right. So, Brian, tell me a little bit about yourself.
I am 25. I became a Christian when I was 20. So it was like sophomore year of college. So that's been kind of the defining factor of my life since then. But didn't grow up in the church or anything. So I do think, at least from the people and the friends that I have now, that it's a story that's a little unique in that way, in the way that faith has played out in my life, in the way that I've experienced it, and understood it, because I didn't have parents or church kind of teaching me as I was growing up. You know, some of it was just figuring out by myself, and then some of it was meeting really great, interesting people and learning from them too when I was in my 20s. So,
okay, that sounds really interesting. I'm looking forward to getting into that. Before we do, though, I'd like you to kind of explain the God that you believe in. What God do you believe in? So,
I do believe in the God of the Bible. Particularly, I always say it like this. I don't know if it gets understood, but I particularly believe in the Jesus of the Gospels. And I think the reason I say that is because when you drop the Bible, people have, and understandably so, a lot of preconceived notions on what that is. So although I do believe in the God of the Bible, particularly I believe in Jesus of the Gospels. And I say that as well because if you read the Bible through the lens of Jesus's life, it will give a lot more understanding and light to the way that we read some of the more difficult texts in the Old Testament and all that.
I see. Okay. So, why do you believe?
So, that's probably, if not one of the biggest question that you could ask me. So it's definitely it's hard to tackle, but I will the best of my ability. So when I was, like I said, around 20 years old.
All right. Here Brian gets into his coming to faith story, which in a very real way does explain why he believes, but I want to speed us along to why he still believes, why after 5 years he still finds it credible. So I'll try to summarize his story here for you. When he was about 20, someone shared the gospel with him. He liked the guy, and he had never heard the gospel story before, and he found it really amazing. He felt like there had to be a God, and this story really moved him. But even so, when the guy first asked if he wanted to pray and make an official commitment to the Christian God, Brian said,
I don't think so. I don't, there's definitely, I've never heard this before.
But a couple of weeks later, the guy asked him again, and Brian softened to it. It still felt somehow really real to him. So he prayed. Though he didn't fully understand it yet, he prayed with the guy and he started going to church with him. But after that, he kind of stepped back a bit. He felt really confused when he first started going to church, and didn't he want other things from his college experience, like marijuana, music? Though he kept going to church for a year, he vacillated between two very different lifestyles. And then after a year of that, it started to feel really wishy-washy, and he decided he wanted to commit to this Jesus. He wanted to try it out. He wanted to give it a real shot. So he was thinking about all of this while he was working the closing shift at Old Navy with no one else in the store, and
I wrote out a poem in the fitting room of Old Navy, and the last line of the poem was, I love you, Jesus, my sins are the past. It was kind of my expression of I want to try to live this. I want to try to understand it. I've had these real experiences, and I don't want to live this split dichotomy of a life.
Shortly after that poem incident, Brian made some great friends, some great Christian friends who he would eventually ask to be the best men in his wedding. He feels that the honest, soul-searching conversations he had with them really solidified his young faith and answered a lot of his early questions. So what were those answers? Why, after 5 years, is he sticking with it?
So I asked myself the big questions, particularly over this past year. And what I came to was kind of that the central tenet, I would say, to the Christian faith is a relationship with God and the grace of God. So that's what was really a turning point, at least in my faith, when I started to ask myself some of the big questions. If the overarching theme is getting to know God, and through His grace, I could understand a lot of these big questions more and more. And so I'll hit on a little bit more of what I mean, because that's kind of a blanket statement.
Yeah.
So back to when we were first talking, we were mentioning I believe in the God of the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at the Bible, there are these fantastical stories, right? Especially in the Old Testament, you know, Noah, or all these stories that a lot of times skeptics will quote and be like, "How the heck do you believe that?"
Yeah, I don't think it's exclusive to the Old Testament at all.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fantastical things in the New one
definitely. And I realized that in the New Testament, there are miracle stories, but nothing quite like, for instance, the Noah story. There's more of a personal, very more human, relational stories as opposed to some of the Old Testament stories. And I started to realize that they're kind of the same in the messages that both of these kind of stories play out. And that's that God wants to know us as people, individually and corporately. I think what comes to mind, the best story to demonstrate that, and probably the most human story, which is, I think, what makes the Bible real, is that whenever the Bible talks about people, they're usually like stupid and like all over the place and like don't know what they're doing. And that's how people are. I think if the Bible was totally not historically true, like, people would be a little bit more robotic and storybook-like. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's the story of when one of Jesus's disciples, after walking near Jesus for who knows how long, he sees him do all these radical miracles and all that. He asks Jesus, just like show us the Father, and it will be good for us. It's loose translation there. What she's pretty much saying, like, we all do as humans, most humans, I would argue, would say, okay, God, if you're real, just show up. If you're real, maybe I'll understand them.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much what this disciple of Jesus was saying. Really human stories, cool. And Jesus says, have you not known me? Like, if you knew me, you'd know the Father. And that is probably one of my favorite stories of Jesus, because it's an exclusive statement. He's saying that he's God and he was sent from God, and if you want to know God, you've got to get to know me. So a very personal story, and I don't think the disciple that asked him that really understood even after he said it. I think he was confused after his response yet, because Jesus goes on to say right after that, and if you don't believe, at least believe the miracles that I'm doing. That's what he says. He's like, I've done some amazing miracles. And historically, there's so much eyewitness account to these events that they're true. These things happened. So,
what sort of events would you put into that?
Like water into wine. His first miracle at the wedding. Feeding 5,000 with like a couple fish and a couple.
And are there first-hand accounts outside of the 4 separate Gospels of these things? When you say there are so many first-hand accounts, I'm just curious what you're referencing.
Right. Yeah, I'm just particularly citing the Gospel accounts. So how they were written were based off of eyewitness account. That's how history was written at that time. So eyewitness account. was really like the big proof of historical evidence. And anything else that we have from history at that time period was all written off of eyewitness account, which we still hold as true, whether it's like stories of Caesar and all that. They're all based off eyewitness, and we never question them. But these huge, like, seemingly unreasonable stories that are based off of eyewitness account, we seem to cast off, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think they can be historically held as true, and that we can have that same question as this disciple of Jesus had of like, can you just show us the Father? And like, if you did these big miracles back 2,000 years ago, then why don't you show me something now? Mm-hmm. And I think Jesus, when I had those questions, whether they're consciously like that or not, I feel like it was kind of the same response. Maybe not like an audible voice, but there's this pull of get to know me, this personal relationship. That's probably, I guess, the biggest role in a defining factor of my faith is the relational component, and then grace. Grace is probably an unconditional love is from what I see, and I'm not a scholar of other religions, so I will say that flat out. I do not mean to be disrespectful or offend in any way, but from what I've seen from other religions is that grace is kind of the defining factor of Christianity. At least the other religions that I'm familiar with, there's always this kind of ladder of, this is how you get to know God. This is how you can be enlightened. Do these things. Mm-hmm. The message of the Bible, the message of Jesus, is grace. There's nothing that we can do to get to know God other than saying, I accept what you have done to get to know us. That being Christ dying on the cross and resurrecting. I've heard it said that the cross is, although it seems just outlandish to believe in, if we look at the cross, it's where his justice and his love perfectly meet. And that's why the message of the cross, to me, seems very real. Because God needed to have this holy, justice happen to evil, right? And that's why his perfect son made a sacrifice. But God, being perfectly loving, God of love, gave a way for people to get to know him, that being grace.